Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm here today with Fern Schumer Chapman, author of the book Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement and the Road to Reconciliation. And today we have a really interesting episode because we're going to be attempting to answer an important question, which is how do you talk with other people when it comes to sibling estrangement and such? So this is such an important topic for us. This is something that we hold dear to our hearts. And it is something that comes up more and more in our community. And we want to make sure, of course, that people can have strategies, tools, maybe some interesting approaches to use that will elicit some of those conversations. Welcome, Fern.
Well, it's great to be with you as always. And when I was estranged from my only brother for decades, I became an artful dodger in how to manage this situation. So let me give you a great example. Someone would come up to me and say, "Oh, how's your brother?" And I would just say, "Fine, how's yours?" And that would be how quickly I would get past that moment. And really, it was almost like the question was a hot potato. And I figured if I threw it back at them, I wouldn't have to deal with it.
Absolutely. That's such a great example of what happens to us whenever we're put on the spot, right? Because a lot of times we don't know how to open up towards others when it comes to sibling estrangement. You know, we kind of get that deer in the headlights look, right?
We do, and part of the reason is because the topic is so stigmatized. So, and you also have to really carefully gauge whether this is somebody you want to enter the conversation with, whether this is somebody who will be receptive and compassionate about your experience. Because there's some people who will say things like, "But he's your brother."
Yeah, right. And that's the thing that happens. It gets thrown back at us. And that's one of the things that happens a lot with us is the idea that, you know, it's almost as if the other person makes us feel as though we did something to make this happen, right? And that's the thing that causes us to question ourselves, you know, and in turn we become more hesitant to talk about others about sibling estrangement because of that.
Well, actually, interesting that you mentioned that, because so many people who filled out my survey for brothers, sisters, strangers talked about how people pointed the finger at them, basically saying, "Oh, you don't touch your brother, there must be something wrong with you." And of course, that goes to, are you a safe person for me to have a relationship with?
Yeah. And you can see where that can take a person, especially if they start to go into rumination, and how that can, of course, just make our heads spin when we hear stuff like this, or when we causes us to think that way. So, you know, I think it's really key to continue to have conversations about this particular subject, you know, because I think that all of us need to potentially share with others our experiences, you know, in different aspects of our lives. We're social animals, right? We need to have that ability to do that, you know, and I think that talking about it is a way in which we can show other people that this is much more common with regards to this type of experience, you know.
Right. And actually reduce the stigma, because the more we don't talk about it, the more stigmatized it becomes. Now, if I were to go back and handle that question, "How's your brother?" I wish now, with the knowledge I have, that I had said something like, "Thanks for asking about my brother. We are taking a break from each other at this time."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not that hard. Relationships wax and wane. So it's not, it's not preposterous that this would have happened.
Absolutely. And you're right. I think that that's good that we can normalize this, because it is a normal experience for one person out of three to not get along with their siblings, right? So I think that this gets us into some of the different strategies and pieces of advice we'd like to give to some of our viewers with regards to this. You know, I think that one of the things we need to kind of remind ourselves is we don't need to tell our story from A to Z from the start. You know, I think that that's the thing that happens is, like, once we open up that can, it doesn't mean that every single thing needs to come out from that can, you know? So we don't need to get into the nitty gritty of everything, especially, you know, and even just giving a bird's eye view of what we're doing, I think is sufficient, you know? And when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself to have a bit of an opportunity to talk about this with another person, but in a safe way, And you'll see in some ways as you're interacting with them if the other person's particularly interested in learning more about this, and if it elicits something in them to see that we're not speaking with our sibling, for example.
Right. And I think that had I said that, what I just, my response, which alluded to the fact that we're no longer talking at this time, if that person didn't feel safe, I should set a boundary and simply say, I'm not comfortable discussing all this with you. So for example, if that person said, oh my goodness, well, what's happened? And I don't think that they're a safe person to talk to, I'm not comfortable discussing it, but thanks for asking.
Exactly. We need to start from the beginning, right? And that's good. And if it falters from the beginning, as soon as we're talking about this with someone else, best to not engage, right? So you're absolutely right. I think that's really, really important. And another thing that I think also is really important is to focus on actions and examples rather than on bad mouthing our sibling. It's really easy to fall into a pattern where we start to complain or talk badly about that person that hurt us, right? And I think it's really important not to sink to that level, right? And I mean, people will seem to be curious or inquire about what happened if we pursue the conversation with them. So focusing on key moments and examples where communication broke down, where there was a deal breaker for you somewhere rather. I think when we're talking about some of those situations and seeing ourselves in the third person, for example, can also be a good way to stay more factual about what's happened. So
I think if you are actually talking to a confidant, the way to handle this is not bad mouthing, but to actually talk about your own feelings. I'm terribly hurt that he and I are no longer in touch with each other. I carry this all the time. I ruminate. But really, there's no value in bad mouthing. And there is an inclination to do that because everybody wants to feel supported and that they're right. But that's really not what you need at that moment.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're always free to tell as much or as little as we want about a situation. And like you said, what you're illustrating yourself is process versus content, right? Talking about what it does to us. If we feel that person is safe, we can certainly go into the process rather than the content. And I always find that when people relive things too vividly, I always suggest them when they're seeing it play itself out as they're talking with others, I suggest to people look at it in black and white. Because once you do that, it's a strategy we have in EMDR where you're able to, of course, limit the vividness of the experience. Because for some people, when they say it, they kind of relive it. So this is a way to kind of cut back on that to feel safer, especially when we do talk about it.
Right, you're adding fuel to the fire if you're simply bad mouthing your estranged sibling.
Yeah, and with regards to another strategy that we can have, of course, is yes, we can talk about some of the things that may have happened, key pivotal moments, or our feelings about it, like we were saying, but we can also talk about what empowers ourselves, right? And it's easy for us to want to talk about the hurt, but it's also easy to talk about what it is that we've been inspired to do. Has this freed you up to engage with your chosen family, for example, your friends, the people you want around you, right? Has that allowed you to be more aware of toxic behaviors? I mean, has that allowed you to distinguish between what's safe and an unsafe person, for example? Being more conscious of family relationships. I think there's a whole bunch of different inspirations that we can get that cause us to become better people because of that.
I think that's a good point. And one of the big fallouts of estrangement is that many feel that they cannot trust anyone. And so they withdraw from relationships. And by being forthright and honest about the fact that the estrangement exists, it counteracts that because you're being honest, and that creates trust and hopefully promotes personal relationships.
Absolutely. I do think that there's a closeness that develops when there's vulnerability that is experienced, and when we're using inspiring words and actions to describe a situation, it does, of course, elicit a similar response in other people as well. It brings them in contact with their own strength, perhaps, and I think that's so, so important when we talk about this, and I always like to say to people as well, it's important to realize that we're not going to change the world, we're not going to change that perception of family above all else. I think that's still something that we're all going to be struggling with society's general message, you know. But it's good for us to be exercising change in our own realities with some people around us, right? Could be with friends, colleagues at work, or someone else. As long as we have that conversation, I think that's really, really important.
So many people who responded in my survey said things like, I'm afraid to make friends because I don't trust people as a result of the estrangement. I don't trust anyone. And that's what we're really challenging people to go up against.
Yeah.
This idea that you can't trust anybody. Because as long as you isolate yourself and don't discuss this, you will not have trusting relationships.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that can happen. It can snowball into different ways if we're not careful, with regards to closing ourselves off or letting the mistrust or hurt be the defining factor in other relationships.
Actually, that's actually an important point to make, because I think the reason that sibling estrangement is so devastating is because it ripples through a whole life. It affects your identity. It affects your self-esteem. It affects your family. It affects your social relationships. It affects your friendships.
Mhm.
And you have to find a way to metastasize this cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good way to kind of channel that in a healthy way that you can, of course, continue to walk in dignity and beauty, as I like to say, in some of the support groups I host and such. So I think that invariably we all end up becoming ambassadors for the cause of sibling estrangement. When you start to talk about it, then that's what happens. And it's like we were saying earlier, it's like if someone has a question or somebody starts to talk about something, chances are other people are thinking about it too, you know? So that's really, really important for us to be able to, of course, highlight that and bring that out with some people to show that this is a thing, this is something that happens to us. And I always like to say that when there's more people that know about it, then we succeed in breaking the stigma.
In terms of the content of the emails I receive, and I get a lot of them, most of them end with the same line. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was all alone. And so I think these episodes that we're doing, the books I've written, your workshops, are bringing attention to the fact that they are absolutely not alone. And we often end our sessions by saying, you are not alone. Well, that's because nobody's talking about it, but we are.
Exactly. We're creating that voice, we're bringing the message out, and I'm so happy that we're able to inspire people into seeing themselves as being greater than what their sibling thinks of them. So that is so important. So Fern, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to talk about resources. So what is your number one resource you would suggest at this time for our viewers?
Well, I don't have that many. I keep jumping between three, but
They're
I
good.
will I will say stay tuned to my psychologytoday.com blog posts. I often post them on the Sharing Caring page, and you will learn something new all the time about sibling estrangement.
Absolutely, and it's a good page to go to. Sibling estrangement, sharing, coping, connecting is what you're alluding to, of course. That is a great page for us to, of course, have a community, build some conversations with people of like mind in a safe space, in a private group. And my number one resource right now would probably be the workshop that I'm offering with regards to improving self-esteem after experiencing sibling estrangement. So that is something that I'm very happy to offer. That's a resource I would have liked to have had at the time. So I'm very happy that this is something that is being made available to our community and to anybody that is interested in pursuing with this. So thank you so much for doing this, Fern. It's wonderful to be able to get together and talk about this. I very much look forward to our next episode again.
Me too. We specialize in offering the resources that we yearned for while we were going through this originally.
Very much so. Thank you again.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Take care. Bye-bye.